The woman in the torn hoodie stood in line at the counter, invisible in plain sight, clutching a crumpled plastic bag as if it held everything she owned. No one cared that her hands were shaking. No one noticed how she kept her head down, the thick strands of hair matted against her face hiding everything but the sharp line of her jaw. The smell of rain still clung to her clothes, mixing with the sharp tang of sweat and old fries that filled the air of the McDonald's on Western Avenue. She stepped forward when the person ahead of her left. The boy behind the register barely looked up as he tapped the screen. "What can I get you?" She cleared her throat once, then again, forcing the words out through a dry mouth that tasted like coins. "How much is a hamburger?" He sighed, not loudly, but enough. $2.99. Her fingers shook as she untied the knotted corner of the plastic bag and tipped the contents into her palm. A small handful of coins slid across the counter, some sticky, some dark with age, pennies mostly. A few nickels. There might have been a dime in there, too, but she wasn't sure. She pushed them toward him with the flat of her hand, not looking at his face. "This is all I have." The boy exhaled through his nose. Not annoyed. "Not yet. This isn't enough." She nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't plead. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching, because she already knew they weren't. "I'm hungry," she said quietly, as if stating it made it less pathetic. "I thought maybe," she stopped. She didn't have anything else to say. He stared at her for a second longer than he probably should have, but the line behind her was growing, and the people at the tables were laughing, and the timer for the fries was beeping again, so he glanced over his shoulder, toward the tray where mistakes went to die. And for half a second his hand twitched like he might go for it. He didn't. He turned back to her, shook his head, and started sweeping the coins back toward her. "I can't," he said. "It's not up to me." But it was. It always was. Before she could gather the coins, someone else was there. A hand, smooth and pale and covered in rings, reached across the counter and slammed a gift card down so hard it made the coins jump. "I'll pay for her," the woman said. Her nails were bright red, polished to a perfect shine, and she didn't look at the woman in the hoodie when she said it. She didn't need to. This was a performance. The boy froze. Everyone froze. Not because someone was paying for a stranger's burger, but because of who it was. Everyone knew her face. Everyone had seen it on billboards, magazine covers, red carpets. Brenna Lane. Pop star. Reality show judge. The woman whose smile had sold out arenas. She was here, in heels too high for this floor, with sunglasses too dark for this sky, and now she was buying lunch for a homeless woman without looking at her. It wasn't kindness. It was charity on display. The woman in the hoodie didn't move. She didn't reach for the burger. She didn't say thank you. She waited until Brenna turned slightly toward the cameras she knew were always watching, until her lips curled into that well-practiced smirk that made men think they could save her, and then the woman spoke again. "I didn't ask for your help." Brenna's head tilted just enough to make it look elegant. "It's fine," she said. "It's just a burger." The woman stepped back, coins clutched tight in her fist now, her knuckles white against the grime on her skin. "Then you eat it." Brenna laughed, the kind of laugh that was soft and condescending and made for sound bites. "Don't be stupid," she said, her voice light as glass. "I'm not hungry." "That's the difference," the woman replied, her voice low, flat, stripped of anything but cold truth. "I am." For a second, Brenna's smile faltered. Just for a second. But then the boy behind the counter cleared his throat and muttered, "Do you want it or not?" And that was enough to break whatever tension had begun to coil between them. Brenna stepped back, lifting her phone from her bag, already typing something that would spin this into a story about compassion. The boy grabbed a burger from the tray, one that had been meant for the trash, and shoved it into a paper bag before sliding it across the counter without another word. The woman took it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't look at anyone. She just turned and walked slowly toward the door, each step measured like she was counting them. Halfway there, she stopped. And for the first time since she'd walked in, she raised her head. No one recognized her face, but someone should have. Because under the dirt, under the tangled hair and the cracked glasses, was Jackie Chan. And he was smiling. The door swung shut behind Jackie with a dull thud, but the sound barely registered in the noise of the street. He stood still on the cracked sidewalk for a long moment, feeling the weight of the paper bag in his hand. It was still warm. He thought about throwing it away, but there was no point. It wasn't about the burger. It never was. The people who stared inside that McDonald's, the ones who whispered to each other when Brenna Lane swiped her card without looking him in the eye, weren't thinking about him. They were thinking about themselves. How they would have acted. What they might post later. Jackie had seen enough of those people in his life, dressed differently but all the same in the end. He crossed the street again without looking back. The rain had stopped an hour ago, but water still dripped from the awnings of the buildings and collected in shallow pools along the edge of the pavement. Jackie stepped around them slowly, keeping his head down, ignoring the man on the corner who had been there since morning, shaking a paper cup with 2 coins in the bottom and asking for change without making eye contact. No one had stopped for him either. The alley behind the McDonald's was quiet. Jackie leaned against the cold brick wall and opened the bag. The burger was smashed flat from where the boy had shoved it into the wrapper too hard. He peeled back the paper and took a small bite. It tasted exactly the way he expected it to, which was to say, it tasted like nothing. He chewed slowly, forcing it down. He was used to this part. For all the years he had spent on sets eating cold meals between takes, he had trained himself to swallow without thinking. That was something he had carried with him long before he became famous. "Did you get what you wanted?" The voice came from his right, casual, like it belonged there. Jackie didn't move at first. Then he turned his head slowly. Rachel stood a few feet away, smoking a thin cigarette and watching him. Her apron was tied around her waist still, but she had shoved her hands into the pockets of her jacket and kept her eyes steady on his face. He took another bite of the burger before answering. "Depends what I wanted." She nodded once. "I saw you smiling." Jackie shrugged, folding the paper back over the half-eaten burger. "I was thinking." "About what?" He wiped his fingers on the knee of his jeans. "What happens when people stop looking at you?" Rachel exhaled a long stream of smoke into the air between them. "No one looks at me either." "You get used to it." He nodded. "You shouldn't have reached for that tray." She didn't answer right away. Then she dropped the cigarette and crushed it beneath the heel of her shoe. "You shouldn't have walked in there with a pocket full of pennies." Jackie smiled again, but there was nothing polite about it. "Maybe not." Rachel pushed away from the wall and stepped closer. She didn't look afraid. She looked tired. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked. "You're not homeless." He didn't bother denying it. "I wanted to see if it makes a difference." Did it? He thought about the boy behind the counter. About Brenna Lane. About the people in line who didn't care one way or the other, as long as it didn't slow them down. "It did," he said. "Just not the way I thought." Rachel snorted quietly. "You sound like one of those people who thinks they can fix something just by watching it." Jackie tilted his head slightly. "Can't fix what you don't understand." She gave him a long look, then shook her head. "Understanding won't change anything." He opened the plastic bag again and pulled out the paperback novel. The cover was torn away, but the pages inside were still dry. He held it out to her. "Read." Rachel stared at the book for a second, then took it without a word. She flipped it open and glanced at the first page. "It's in Chinese." Jackie nodded again. "You asked why I'm doing this," he said. "I was looking for a different answer." She tucked the book under her arm. "Find it?" "Not yet." Rachel looked back toward the street. The lights from the restaurant shone through the rain-speckled windows, casting a pale reflection onto the wet asphalt. "You know Coleman's gonna fire me if he figures out who you are." Jackie's hands closed loosely around the crumpled paperback. "He doesn't have to." She raised an eyebrow. "You gonna stop him?" He shook his head. "I don't stop people like him." Rachel nodded once, like she understood. "You let them stop themselves." Neither of them spoke for a moment. The rain started again, light and cold against their faces. Rachel pulled her hood up and shoved the cigarette pack back into her pocket. "If you come back tomorrow," she said, "try bringing quarters." Jackie gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll think about it." She turned and walked away, her boots splashing through the puddles. Jackie stayed where he was, watching her go, then slowly sat down on the damp concrete, his back against the wall. He finished the burger in silence. He didn't know yet if he was coming back tomorrow, but he knew someone else would be. The next day, he arrived earlier. The sky was dull, without any sharpness in the color, and it seemed like everyone moved a little slower, though the streets were still full of people who had places to be. Jackie wore the same clothes. He didn't add anything new. His shoes were soaked from the night before, but he kept them on. He sat at the edge of the alley for a while, watching the front entrance of the McDonald's. People filed in and out. Some walked out with paper bags and cups in their hands. Others stayed for less than a minute before turning around, glancing at their phones, shaking their heads as if the place was taking too long. Jackie waited until the crowd around the door thinned out. Then he stood and crossed the street again. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of grease and the faint odor of mop water. The tile floor was sticky beneath his shoes. Jackie kept his head down as he made his way toward the counter. It wasn't Rachel behind the register this time. It was a tall young man with narrow shoulders and a face that didn't look old enough to shave properly. His name tag said, Evan. He tapped the screen twice before glancing up, his expression flat. What do you want? Evan asked, his voice clipped and uninterested. Jackie opened his hand. This time there was a small pile of quarters. He set them down carefully. Coffee, he said. Evan stared at the coins. His fingers hovered over the screen for a second before he pressed the button. Medium. Small, Jackie answered. Evan didn't say anything else. He picked up a cup, filled it halfway, set it on the counter, and then turned away before Jackie could take it. Jackie picked it up without a word and moved toward the far corner of the seating area. There was a spot near the window that hadn't been cleaned. An old receipt stuck to the table with dried soda. He sat down anyway. The coffee was hot but bitter, and he drank it slowly, watching the door. An hour passed before Rachel showed up. She wasn't working. She was still in uniform, but her apron was gone and her jacket hung loosely around her shoulders. She walked straight toward his table without hesitating and dropped something in front of him. It was a muffin in a paper bag, still warm from the oven. On me, she said, sliding into the seat across from him before he could argue. I get an employee discount. Jackie nodded. Thank you. Rachel watched him for a moment, then pulled out the book he had given her yesterday. She set it on the table between them. I can't read it, she said. But I looked at the pages anyway. He took a sip of coffee. What did you see? She tilted her head a little, thinking. It looked like a lot of things I don't understand. That's what it is, Jackie replied. Rachel tapped a finger on the cover. You're not going to tell me who you really are you? He shook his head slowly. I don't think it would help. Rachel sighed and leaned back in the chair. Probably not. They sat there in silence for a few minutes. Jackie ate the muffin in small bites. It was soft, sweeter than he expected. He finished it without speaking, then folded the paper bag neatly and set it on the edge of the table. Evan walked past them, carrying a bucket and mop. His gaze flickered toward Rachel, but he didn't say anything. Rachel didn't look at him. Jackie watched the way her shoulders stiffened, the way she kept her hands still on the table. He could tell she was waiting for something to happen. What did Coleman say? Jackie asked finally. Rachel shrugged, but it wasn't casual. He told me not to do it again. He didn't write me up. Not yet. He will, Jackie said. Rachel nodded. Yeah. The mop slapped against the tile floor behind them. Evan hummed quietly under his breath. Jackie glanced at him once, then turned back to Rachel. Do you ever think about leaving? He asked. Rachel laughed once, but there wasn't much humor in it. All the time. But leaving means giving up the paycheck. And right now, I can't afford that. Jackie studied her face. She looked tired. More tired than she had yesterday. He understood that kind of tiredness. It wasn't just about sleep. He slid the folded paper bag toward her. What would you do instead? Rachel looked at it like it was a question she hadn't thought about in a long time. I don't know, she said quietly. I used to think I'd go back to school. Maybe get into social work. But that feels like another lifetime. It's not, Jackie said. She looked at him for a long time after that, but he didn't say anything else. The door opened and closed a dozen times while they sat there. Nobody paid them any attention. After a while, Rachel stood up. I've got to get back. Jackie nodded. Thank you for the muffin. Rachel half smiled. Don't get used to it. She walked away then, her shoes squeaking faintly on the sticky floor. Jackie stayed where he was, drinking the last of the cold coffee and watching the people come and go. None of them looked at him. None of them noticed anything. But he noticed them, and he was beginning to see something he hadn't before. It was Friday when things changed. The McDonald's was busier than usual, which meant more people in line, more voices talking over each other, and more chances to go unnoticed. Jackie sat in the same spot as before, near the window, the same table with the dried soda on the surface and a receipt stuck to it by some old stain. Nobody had cleaned it. He didn't expect they ever would. The same smell lingered in the air, grease mixed with the faint staleness of old coffee and wet clothing. It had rained earlier that morning, but no one cared enough to wipe their shoes before coming in, so the floor was streaked with dirty footprints that someone would eventually mop up, but not yet. Rachel was behind the counter again. She was working the register, and when she saw Jackie walk in, her eyes flickered toward him just once before she looked away. She didn't smile. She didn't nod. She just did her job. Jackie waited in line behind 3 people. He heard them arguing about something small, something to do with a missing order, and the man at the front raised his voice to Rachel, accusing her of not listening to him properly. Rachel stayed calm. She didn't argue back. She just repeated his order slowly and handed him the receipt without showing any reaction to his attitude. Jackie didn't move. He kept his hands in his pockets and watched quietly. When it was his turn, Rachel didn't hesitate. "What can I get you?" she asked. Jackie placed 3 quarters on the counter. "Coffee." Rachel pressed the button on the screen and picked up a cup. She filled it halfway, just like she had before, and set it on the counter without saying anything more. Jackie took it without speaking and walked back to the window table. He sat there for a long time, drinking the coffee slowly, watching the door open and close as people came and went. An hour passed. Then another. Rachel took her break and disappeared toward the back. Evan replaced her at the counter, wearing the same bored expression as before. Jackie stayed where he was. He noticed Coleman standing near the entrance to the kitchen, watching everything without moving. Coleman's arms were crossed, and he spoke to no one. His eyes moved over the tables, the customers, the line at the register. When his gaze stopped on Jackie, it didn't leave for a while. Jackie stayed still. He finished his coffee and left the empty cup on the table. His fingers rested loosely around the edge of the cup, but he didn't fidget or tap it. He waited. Coleman moved eventually. His footsteps were quiet on the tile, but Jackie heard them anyway. The manager stopped beside his table, arms still crossed, his face blank. "You planning on staying here all day?" Coleman asked. His voice was low, but not friendly. Jackie looked up. "I'm drinking coffee." "You've been drinking coffee for 2 hours. It's hot." Coleman didn't smile. "You're making people uncomfortable." Jackie glanced around the room. No one was looking at him. Most were staring at their phones or focused on their food. A few were talking quietly at their tables, but no one seemed to notice anything unusual. Jackie turned back to Coleman. "I haven't bothered anyone." Coleman stepped closer. His shoes made a faint squeak against the floor. "You've been sitting here every day this week." Jackie nodded. "It's warm." Coleman's jaw tightened. He exhaled through his nose. "This isn't a shelter." Jackie nodded again. "I know. You can't stay here." "I bought coffee." Coleman's voice hardened. "You're taking up space." Jackie kept his voice calm. "There are other tables." Coleman leaned forward slightly. "If you don't leave, I'll have to ask security to remove you." Jackie tilted his head. "Is that necessary?" Coleman's eyes narrowed. "I don't make the rules." Jackie studied him for a moment. "But you enforce them." "That's my job." Jackie stood slowly, picking up the empty cup and carrying it to the trash. He dropped it in without a sound. Coleman watched him the entire time. Jackie turned toward the door, but before he left, he looked back at Rachel. She was behind the counter again, serving a woman with 2 kids. She didn't look at him. Outside, the street was louder. Traffic had picked up. Jackie crossed the road and stood in front of the boarded-up shop window. He didn't move for several minutes. People brushed past him without stopping. Some glanced at him. Most didn't. He stayed there until he saw Rachel come out the side door of the restaurant, tying her jacket around her waist and walking quickly toward the bus stop. Jackie followed. Not close. Just enough to stay within sight. When Rachel reached the corner, she stopped and turned around. She saw him immediately. She didn't look surprised. She waited until he caught up, then spoke without any introduction. "He wants you gone," Rachel said. Jackie nodded. "I know. He's going to make sure you don't come back." Jackie didn't answer. Rachel crossed her arms, staring at him. "You're pushing it." Jackie's voice was quiet. "Do you care?" Rachel hesitated, then shook her head. "I don't know." They stood there for a while, neither speaking. The bus arrived, brakes hissing, doors folding open. Rachel climbed on board without looking back. Jackie stayed where he was. He would go back the next day. By noon the next day, Jackie was back inside. The restaurant was crowded again, though the noise was different than usual. There was a tension to it. A group of teenagers laughed loudly near the window, their feet kicked up on empty chairs, while an older couple sat nearby, eating in silence, their eyes flickering toward the door every time it opened. Jackie stood in line like he had every day, holding a $1 bill between his fingers. When it was his turn, he slid the money across the counter. Evan was there again, slower than usual, barely meeting his eyes. "Coffee?" Evan asked without waiting for an answer. Jackie nodded. Evan took the money, punched the keys on the screen, and slid a cup toward him. No questions. No comments. Just the transaction. Jackie took it and moved toward the same table, but before he reached it, Coleman was there. He was standing at the table, arms crossed again, mouth set in the same tight line as before. "Not a day," Coleman said. Jackie stopped. "I paid." Coleman took a step forward. "You're not welcome here." Jackie held the coffee loosely in his hand. He didn't move. I haven't done anything wrong. Coleman didn't blink. You're loitering. I'm sitting. You're making my staff uncomfortable. Jackie looked toward the counter. Rachel was working, head down, ringing up orders. She didn't look over. Evan was gone, replaced by someone else. Jackie turned back to Coleman. I haven't spoken to anyone. Coleman took another step forward. His shoes scuffed loudly on the floor. You need to leave. Jackie stayed where he was. No. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Coleman stepped back and raised his hand, signaling towards someone by the door. A security guard appeared almost immediately, dressed in black, wearing a badge clipped to his chest. He walked over quickly, stopping beside Coleman, waiting. Coleman didn't look away from Jackie. You're trespassing. Jackie shook his head. I'm a customer. You're not a customer we want, Coleman said. The security guard shifted his weight, clearing his throat. You're going to have to come with me. Jackie didn't argue. He set the coffee on the table and followed the guard toward the door. People watched now. I tracked him as he walked, some curious, some avoiding his glance, but all of them aware. Rachel stood behind the counter, staring at the register, her hand frozen over the buttons. Outside, the air was colder than before. The guard stopped just outside the door, letting it close behind them before speaking again. You can't come back. Jackie nodded. I understand. The guard didn't say anything else. He waited for Jackie to walk away. Jackie did, slowly, crossing the street, his shoes scraping against the pavement. He stood on the sidewalk for a few minutes, watching the door. No one came out. No one followed. An hour later, Jackie was still there. He leaned against the cold brick of the building, hands in his pockets, watching. Some people walked past him. A few gave him sideways looks. Most didn't stop. He waited until Rachel's shift ended. She came out the side door again, her jacket pulled tight around her, her hair tied back the same way it always was. She saw him immediately. She didn't stop walking, but she spoke as he fell into step beside her. You're lucky Coleman didn't call the police. Jackie kept his voice quiet. Would you have? Rachel shrugged. It's not up to me. It could be. No, she said. It's not. They walked in silence for half a block. Then Jackie spoke again. Why do you stay? Rachel's jaw tightened, but she answered. Because I need the money. Jackie nodded. And if you didn't? She didn't look at him. I'd leave. They crossed at the light, the traffic waiting around them. Jackie kept pace with her. I can make that happen. Rachel stopped walking. She turned toward him, her expression unreadable. What are you talking about? He reached into his jacket. His hand came out with an envelope, plain and unmarked. He held it out. Rachel didn't take it. What's in it? She asked. Jackie's voice was steady. Enough. Rachel stared at him for a long time. I don't want charity. It's not charity. Then what is it? It's a chance. Rachel exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air. She took the envelope without opening it. Why me? Jackie's answer was quiet. Because you made a different choice. She held the envelope loosely, as if deciding whether to keep it or throw it away. What's your real name? Jackie shook his head. You'll find out soon enough. She looked at him again, longer this time. Then she nodded once. I hope you know what you're doing. He nodded back. So do I. Rachel turned and walked toward the bus stop without looking back. Jackie stayed where he was until the bus came and left again. The next morning, Coleman came to work early. He found the restaurant locked. A sign taped to the door read, closed for private event. He pounded on the glass, shouting for someone to open it. No one did. An hour later, the media showed up. Cameras, reporters, people with microphones. Coleman stood frozen as they crowded around him, asking for statements. Behind them, Jackie appeared, no longer wearing the hoodie, his hair trimmed, his face clean. He stepped up to the door, keys in hand. He unlocked it and pushed it open. Welcome, he said to the cameras. Let me show you what happens when we stop looking away.